Good afternoon to everybody. Here we are to start another seminar session here in the Department of Law of the University of Girona. And we are very pleased to announce to have among us the visit of Professor Stephen Wall, who is a leading figure in the field of political philosophy and other related areas such as ethics and even legal philosophy. Jordi Ferrer, the chair or the headmaster of this department, usually says that here in Girona we are not very fond of very large introductions. We prefer the authors and their works to speak for themselves. But anyway, a few introductory remarks I believe are in order to present you, because especially they are related to your academic life in recent years. So let me just say a few words as a way of introduction. Stephen, after getting his master's degree in political science in the University of Columbia, spent some years doing doctoral research in the University of Oxford under the supervision of Joseph Russ. And as a corollary of those very years, there came a book which was called Liberalism, Perfectionism and Restraint, which was a very celebrated book back to those years, and in which there were presented two versions. There were clearly demarked what was a perfectionist view of politics and an anti-perfectionist view of politics. And Stephen clearly adds like a third position to those understandings, which is called liberal perfectionism, and which is actually the theory he is going to speak about today. Among the different achievements of Steve, we can mention, for instance, many works and papers published in some of the most famous and important journals of the English-speaking world, such as, for instance, Ethics, or Social Theory in Practice, or the Philosophical Quarterly, Law and Philosophy, the Journal on Philosophy, and many others. In these journals, he copes with these and other topics like the Rawlsian conception of neutrality, equality, the rule of law, paternalism, and some others. He taught in the University of Connecticut, in Bowling Green State University, in Kansas State University, and today he's professor of philosophy in the University of Arizona. Steve, thank you very much for being with us, and this audience is all yours.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm honored to be a participant in this seminar, which has had so many distinguished philosophers. So as Matthias mentioned, today in this seminar, I want to talk about the value of autonomy, and in particular, I want to talk about autonomy in the context of its relation to this view, liberal perfectionism. It's a view in contemporary political philosophy, one that I've defended in other works. Now, on this liberal perfectionist view, people that go for this accept what we might call the traditional understanding of political authority. Namely, this is the view that it's permissible, indeed fitting, for the state to promote actively and intentionally the good of its members. So in this view, the state should be in the business of promoting good lives. And that commitment to the traditional understanding of political authority places liberal perfectionism in opposition to other forms of liberalism, most notably John Rawls's political liberalism, but also all those different versions of public reason liberalism that are quite fashionable these days. Liberal perfectionism, as its name implies, is still a form of liberalism. It's still a form of liberalism because it's committed to limited government. And so, just for example, most liberal perfectionists reject coercive efforts to promote good lives. They're suspicious of things like coercive paternalism or moralistic legislation. And defenders of liberal perfectionism often argue that we have good reason to construe autonomy as a key ingredient of a good human life. And so autonomy is an aspect of the good. And when we do this, then we're in a position to explain how one can accept the traditional understanding of political authority that perfectionists accept, and also the principled commitment to limited government that liberals accept. So autonomy provides this kind of link between the perfectionism and the liberalism. And I want to talk about that today and raise some kind of worries about that. Now let me just say a little bit more about autonomy up front. So I said on this view of politics, autonomy is a perfection, which by that I mean it's a perfectionist good because it's taken to contribute to the goodness of a human life. Now, of course, there are other ways to understand autonomy. I say in the paper it's a protean notion. So lots of different conceptions and understandings of autonomy. Sometimes people refer to autonomy when they're working out a metaphysical account of agency. Other times when people talk about autonomy, they understand it as a condition on moral action, like the Kantians. And then still others, even when they understand autonomy as a normative value, they resist the idea that we should view it as a perfection, as an aspect of the good. So just to take an example, Joel Feinberg's work, really important in the philosophy of the criminal law. Feinberg understands autonomy as a basic moral right, or maybe better, a set of moral rights. And these rights have to be honored, even if they're not congruent with our good. So just to bring this out, Feinberg says things like we have an autonomy-based right to drink toxic chemicals or to sell ourselves into permanent servitude. Those things are not congruent with our good, but we have a right to do it, autonomy-based right. So there are different ways to understand autonomy, but in my talk today, I'm not really concerned with reviewing all the different conceptions of autonomy. I want to focus on autonomy understood as a perfectionist good. And I want to discuss the extent to which it can support a principled commitment to limited government. And doing so, I think, will help us understand better the nature and plausibility of liberal perfectionism. So in a way, the talk's just saying, let's, for the next 2 hours, think of autonomy in this particular way, that it's an aspect of the good, and then let's try to think about whether it could support the liberal commitment to limited government. And the discussion in the paper focuses on two, what I think are important challenges that can be pressed against the claim that autonomy is a genuine human perfection that supports a principled commitment to limited government. And what I argue in the paper is that a good response to the first challenge makes it harder to come up with a good response to the second challenge. After discussing the challenges, then I kind of revisit liberal perfectionism and ask how we might think about its commitment to limited government in light of what we've learned about autonomy's standing as a perfectionist good. So let me start. I have to do this to prepare the ground for the discussion of the challenges. I'll try to be brief, but I want to say a few more words about how I'm understanding autonomy in this paper. Because even if autonomy is understood as a good, even if it's understood as a perfection, it admits of various descriptions. So what I want to do here is just set out in kind of summary form how I and others who are sympathetic to liberal perfectionism have tended to characterize autonomy. Autonomy is achieved when a person leads his life on his own terms. He's not forced by others or by circumstance to go down one path, but instead fashions his own life and his own character by self-consciously choosing goals and projects and assuming commitments and taking on responsibilities from among a wide range of eligible options. The autonomous person strives to achieve a good life in his own way and according to his own understanding of what is valuable and worth doing. So understood, autonomy applies to a person's whole life, or at least to substantial stretches of it. It's an ongoing achievement. It's not something exercised in kind of a one-shot deal, what you might do if you sold yourself into slavery. That choice might be autonomous, but that wouldn't capture the value of autonomy, understood as a perfection. Now, the autonomous person I've just described resembles in some ways the strong-willed individualist in Mill's On Liberty. Mill has this notion of individuality, and that I believe, is a perfectionist notion. I think Mill is a kind of liberal perfectionist. And there are clear affinities between Mill's notion of individuality and autonomy. I say this here because I'll mention Mill several times in my talk today. But I do want to note that Mill's celebration of individuality is bound up with his, I would say, inflamed worries about the despotism of custom. As a result, individuality for Mill shades into eccentricity, where the mere unwillingness to go along with established ways becomes a virtue. By contrast, autonomy, understood as a perfection, neither recommends nor condemns conventional or customary plans of life. As I'll explain, to be autonomous, people must be independent-minded, but independent-minded people do not have to turn their lives into experiments in living. The autonomous person is also not required to maximize choice in his life. He can defer to the authority of others, like I did at lunch, to my benefit. And he can restrict his own liberty to act as he pleases in the future. There's a balance to be achieved here, of course. Autonomy is not consistent with a total surrender of our decision-making to others, nor is it consistent with assuming commitments that leave us with no room to maneuver in the future. You might think again of Mill when he discusses things like marriage. He's really nervous about it because he thinks this is a kind of commitment, even if you enter into it autonomously. It just closes off too many options in the future for too long. Right? So I think there's something right about that, even if I'm not as hostile to the institution of marriage as Mill was. Now, autonomy is a personal achievement, but it's not an achievement one achieves on one's own. To be autonomous, a person must have certain internal competences, a secure access to a sufficient range of options, and they must live in a tractable environment. And these conditions must be cultivated or established with the help of others, including the state. A little more specifically, an autonomous person needs to meet a threshold with respect to 5 general conditions. These are mental capacities, character traits, options, independence, and environment. Now, obviously, a good deal could be said about each of these conditions and their respective thresholds. For present purposes, I'll just say a few words about each. The mental capacities include the capacities needed to form and pursue plans and goals effectively, and to endorse or identify with the plans and goals that one has adopted. The character traits include the self-awareness and vigor necessary to take control of one's affairs, as well as the steadiness needed to sustain commitments to the plans and goals that one adopts. Just note here that it's possible for a person to be alienated from the goals and pursuits that have come to define his life. An autonomous person is not alienated in this way. He develops a normative conception of himself and a evaluative stance, and this stance guides him in his selection and pursuit of goals. We can think of this evaluative stance as the agent's standpoint as a practical reasoner. The options condition, the 4th of the conditions I mentioned, speaks to the need for people to have access and to be aware of the fact that they have access to a sufficiently wide range of options from which to choose from in charting their own course through life. Specific freedoms to do this or that action add to the range of options, but no specific freedom may be necessary for the range to be adequate. The independence condition, by contrast, concerns the relations between people. To be autonomous, people must be relatively free from the coercion and manipulation of others. This condition supplements the option condition, since a person can have his independence compromised even if he retains access to a sufficiently wide range of options. This condition helps to explain why interference from others that closes off an option is widely taken to be more invasive of autonomy than obstructions imposed by nature that have the effect of closing off the very same option. But while this thought is common, it's also puzzling. Why should the source of the obstacle to my choice matter for my autonomy? In an effort to answer this question, some have suggested that coercion and manipulation have an expressive dimension that accounts for why they compromise autonomy over and above their impact on the availability of options. And I'll return to this interesting idea that there's this expressive dimension to coercion and manipulation. I'll return to that at the end of my talk. So far, I've mentioned 4 conditions. The 5th condition, the environment condition, just refers to factors in one's environment, both natural and social, that impinge on one's ability to plan one's life. Some environments are supportive of autonomous agency, while others are not. For example, an environment that's predictable is conducive to the achievement of autonomy, whereas one that's chaotic or subject to rapid change will frustrate our efforts to plan a life and achieve goals. So here, I didn't talk about it in the paper, but there's a kind of autonomy-based defense of the rule of law one can present along these lines. The rule of law helps to make the environment tractable such that people can plan their lives effectively. Now, the state can play a role in securing or helping to bring about each of the conditions I've mentioned. On a liberal perfectionist view of politics, the state ought to do so, because the state ought to be in the business of promoting good lives. However, autonomy understood as a perfection is but one ingredient of a good life. And since autonomy is but one ingredient of a good life, it may on occasion need to be subordinated to other perfections. To believe that autonomy is a perfection, one doesn't have to think that it's a perfection that takes priority over all other perfections. Now, you may wonder why autonomy is so characterized as a perfection. Why is it a good? Mill advanced one answer. In discussing his ideal of individuality, he stressed the connection between this ideal and self-development. Mill said the human faculties of perception, judgment, discriminative feeling, mental activity, and even moral preference are exercised only in making a choice. I will challenge this claim in a moment, but even if it were accepted, it would threaten to prove too much. Taken to its limit, it would seem to imply that an autonomous person should not defer to the authority of others, even when it was reasonable for him to do so. In deferring to an authority, the person would lose the opportunity to exercise and develop the human faculties associated with making choices. The self-development that Mill associated with autonomous choice, at any rate, is not a consideration that's typically on the mind of the choosing agent. Typically, he does not make choices in order to develop his capacities. He makes choices to pursue things he perceives to be worth pursuing. He chooses with the aim of choosing well. And with that aim in mind, he can appreciate why it is reasonable for him to defer to the authority or expertise of others when it makes sense for him to do so. The reasonable agent, we might say, will outsource some of his decision-making to others who are better placed to make good decisions. The anarchist philosopher Robert Paul Wolff has argued that the autonomous person must not surrender decision-making authority to anyone on any occasion. Striking position. But if this view were correct, then the autonomous person could not be fully reasonable. For sometimes, indeed quite often, it is unreasonable not to delegate decision-making authority to others. So a good characterization of autonomy, unlike Wolff's view, should not have the consequence that being autonomous requires us to be practically unreasonable. The autonomous decision and the practically reasonable decision can come apart, to be sure, but it should not be in the nature of autonomy that its realization requires us to be practically unreasonable. So we're now, at last, in a position to appreciate what I'm calling the first challenge to autonomy's claim to be a genuine human perfection. If some delegation of decision-making authority is practically reasonable, then perhaps we should be willing to delegate decision-making authority whenever and wherever there is someone or somebody that reliably could make better decisions for us than we could for ourselves. Autonomous decision-making is reasonable when we're in a position to make good decisions, but not reasonable when others are better placed to make decisions for us. Now, it's often claimed that people in general are the best judges of what is good for themselves. This is likely an exaggeration, but even if this optimism about people's prudential abilities were warranted, we can easily imagine situations in which it would be reasonable for them to accept that others know better than they do about what is good for them. In fact, we can construct scenarios in which people would do better, that is, make more reasonable decisions, if they deferred to others not just about this or that matter, but about all the important decisions that they needed to make about how to lead their lives. Some deference to authority is compatible with autonomous agency, but total deference to others is not. The first challenge maintains that if we get the scenario right, then total deference to others is the practically reasonable option. Thus, if autonomy excludes it, then realizing autonomy requires one to be practically unreasonable. And this, I have claimed, is an unacceptable consequence for an account of autonomy. Let me now just present a little scenario that raises the worry the first challenge presents. Suppose I know that you are wise, much wiser than me, and that you have an excellent understanding of what is good for me. You know my talents, temperament, vulnerabilities. You know what types of projects would best suit my nature. Further, suppose I know that you are a person of goodwill who cares about my well-being, and that you have sufficient time to devote to my life. Given all these suppositions, we can ask, should I let you take control of my decision-making? Would I lead a better life if I always deferred to your judgment whenever I was confronted with an important decision? Now, many people, I think, upon hearing a scenario like that, have some inclination to say no. They think that it's intrinsically good for people to make their own decisions, at least concerning important matters, and at least some of the time. This judgment supports the claim that autonomy is a genuine perfection. I'd support for that intuition. And this is indeed my own view, but the example challenges us to explain why this is the case. Are you not, in the imagined scenario, a reliable authority to whom I should defer if I aim to choose well, as I must, to the extent that I'm committed to being practically reasonable? It's tempting here, in response, to invoke the self-development benefits to which Mill called attention. You should let me make some important decisions so that I will develop the human faculties engaged in making choices and decisions. But in fact, this will not help us, for nothing prevents me from engaging in rational deliberation about what I should do. An engagement in rational deliberation should enable me to exercise and develop the relevant faculties. In deferring to you, I commit only to doing what you say. I do not need to refrain from forming judgments about what I should do. To submit to an authority, it is sometimes said, is to surrender one's judgment, but this is not strictly true. One does not need to surrender one's judgment. One merely commits to following the judgment of the authority when it conflicts with one's own judgment. Notwithstanding this point, it will remain true that if my judgments about how I should live conflict too greatly with the judgments you, as the authority, would make for me, then in deferring to you, I would be, in an important sense, alienated from my life. The decisions that I would make, that is, the decisions that would result from my deference to you as the authority, would not be congruent with my own evaluative stance. And if I'm alienated from my life in this way, then, or so it seems, I could not lead a good life. A better life for me would be one in which my decisions were just as wise, but flowed from or cohered with my own take on what it made sense to do. Now, since you are wise, you will know this. You will know that if I'm alienated from my life, I will not be able to live a fully good life. You might decide then to take my evaluative stance as fixed in your efforts to direct me to live well. But now an important issue arises. Suppose my evaluative stance is misguided. The things I value and care about are not worth caring about, or the ends I've settled on are degrading or immoral. Should you, as someone who cares about my well-being, direct me to pursue these worthless aims in, say, a more efficient or rational manner? Well, that doesn't seem right. What you should do is not help me pursue my worthless ends, but instead try to get me to give them up. Consider next the more fortunate situation in which my evaluative stance is not deeply misguided. I care about things worth caring about. Here it seems more appropriate for you to take my evaluative stance as fixed in your efforts to direct me to live well. If so, then in directing my life, you would be respecting my autonomy in a sense, for you would be advising me to act in light of my own understanding of what's valuable and worth doing. I said earlier that the autonomous person strives to achieve a good life in his own way and according to his own understanding of what is worth doing. So in directing my life, you would now honor this aspiration. Yet autonomy is not only a matter of a person living a life that's congruent with his understanding of what's valuable and worth doing. It's also a matter of the person actually taking the reins and making decisions about how to lead his life. With this in mind, we can sharpen the challenge. Assuming that I know that you will honor my evaluative stance, why should it be important for me to make my own decisions about how to live? If I know that you're better at making decisions for me that will further the ends and values that I have, why should I not defer to you? Is this not the practically reasonable course of action? And so I think these questions take us to the very heart of the challenge. For it's practically reasonable for us to let others make decisions for us in a wide range of contexts, so long as we know that they will do so in a way that furthers our ends. I defer to my doctor about my health. I defer to my accountant about my taxes, etc. The scenario we've been considering, it can be said, is just an extension of this kind of rational deference. In responding to this challenge, The first thing to say is that autonomy doesn't require us to maximize decision-making in our lives. We can distinguish in a very rough way decisions that are trivial or not central to our efforts to lead good lives, and lives on our own terms, on the one hand, from decisions that are closer to the core of our evaluative stance. Deference to others with respect to the former does not compromise our autonomy, while deference to others with respect to the latter very well may. But if we say this, as I think we should, then it seems as if we're saying that with respect to the really important decisions in our life, the decisions that bear most directly on who we are as an agent, it's less important for us to make the best decisions that we could make. And once again, autonomy seems to be in tension with practical reasonableness. We have been assuming, however, that a person, a wise friend or authority, could direct us in our lives and make our decisions for us while still respecting our evaluative stance. This assumption, I now want to argue, is mistaken. It rests on the thought that there's a sharp distinction between our evaluative stance, the goals and commitments and concerns that matter to us, and the decisions that we make to pursue or realize those concerns. But in fact, there is no such sharp distinction. A person's evaluative stance is dynamic, develops over time. We adjust our ends in light of the means available for pursuing them, often discovering in the process of pursuing one end that we value some other end more. Now, we can imagine an agent that has what we might term a fully articulated evaluative stance. Such an agent would have a complete and fully ordered system of ends and a contingency plan that covered all possible situations for pursuing them. He would have, and Alan Gibbard has this term, a hyper plan. It's just that kind of thing. All the ends are worked out, and we have a contingency plan for pursuing them under every possible set of circumstances. So imagine that an agent had one of these hyper plans, then the authority, in the scenario I've constructed, could simply execute the hyper plan. Well, human beings aren't like this. That's the first thing we can say. We do not have fully articulated evaluative stances. But there's a further problem. An evaluative stance, whether fully articulated or not, is not something one is born with. One develops it as one makes decisions about how to lead one's life. These decisions are self-forming or self-constituting in the sense that they make us into one kind of person rather than another. We need to make these decisions ourselves in order to have our own evaluative stances in the first place. This means that even for the fictional agent who has a fully articulated evaluative stance, there was a time when he needed to make his own decisions. He can now safely relinquish his autonomy only because he has completed his autonomous self-formation. It might be objected at this point that a person does not need to make decisions about his life in order to develop or construct his own evaluative stance. So long as he can consider in his mind's eye, as it were, the full range of options open to him, then he can just decide what is and what is not important to him. So on this kind of objection, he doesn't ever need to actually make any decisions. So long as he can just kind of present them in his mind's eye, he can kind of figure everything out, get arrive at a fully articulated evaluative stance. So that seems like a possibility. I want to suggest that there are important cases, however, in which what one values is revealed by the choice that one makes. So prior to the choice or decision, one doesn't know whether one cares more about, say, X or Y. It's only in choosing Y over X that one discovers something about oneself. Merely thinking about the options does not allow one to fully understand one's evaluative stance. Thus, in constructing or developing a normative conception of oneself, one needs to do more than think about what decisions one would be inclined to make under various circumstances. One must actually make decisions. Further, having decided to pursue one option over another, one now will come to have reasons that one did not have prior to the decision. This aspect of autonomous agency can be termed normative self-creation. It's a term from Joseph Raz. Engaging the process of normative creation, I will just point out here, is fully consistent with responding faultlessly to the reasons that apply to one. For practical reason, we'll often not determine fully what we should do. The options we confront may be of equal or incommensurate value, and our choice of one option over another, while not determined by reason, may be consistent with it. I've been explaining why it's a mistake to think that there's a sharp distinction between an agent's evaluative stance and the choices and decisions that he makes in the course of leading his life. The idea that there is this sharp distinction was needed to explain how a wise friend or authority could direct our lives, in effect, make our decisions for us, while still fully respecting our evaluative stance. We've now seen that for a person to lead a life that's congruent with his evaluative stance, he needs to make his own decisions about the central projects and goals that define his life. He cannot outsource these decisions to an authority, however competent or well-motivated that authority may be. But we haven't yet posed the first challenge. For recall, it seemed important to discuss how an authority could try to respect our evaluative stance in making decisions for us, because without doing so, or so I suggested, it would threaten to alienate us from our lives. The decisions that I would make, that is, the decisions that would result from my deference to you, the authority, would not be congruent with my own standpoint as a practical reasoner. And if I'm alienated from my life in this way, then I could not lead a fully good life. But now, it might be said, an authority could take over my evaluative stance, implanting beliefs and values in me, so that I not only make good decisions by deferring to the authority, but I also endorse those decisions and hence experience no alienation. In this scenario, the life I experienced would reflect neither my decisions nor my judgments. I would cease to live my own life and instead would be an extension of the will of the authority. We think, or at least most of us do, that such a life could not be a good human life. This judgment does not entail that autonomy is an intrinsic good. There are forms of agency that are less demanding than autonomous agency, and one could appeal to a less demanding form of agency to explain why a life controlled in this totalizing way could not be a good life. But this judgment, taken in conjunction with the other points I've pressed, is sufficient to turn back the first challenge. Now, you might suspect I've taken an unnecessarily circuitous route to turn back this challenge. I could have just claimed simply that it's good for people to make their own decisions, whether they do so well or poorly. That's how most people respond to this challenge. But if I had said this, then I would have run into trouble in explaining how autonomy and submission to rational authority is possible. The first challenge gets traction because a plausible view of autonomy is not in conflict with our practical reason. It doesn't prevent us from responding correctly to the reasons that we have, including the reasons provided by rational authorities. The first challenge generalizes from ordinary and compelling cases of submission to rational authority to the global case in which we turn all our decisions over to another. That's why it's not subject to simple rebuttal. Let me turn now to the second challenge. In responding to the first challenge, I helped myself to the idea of normative self-creation. This idea helped us to see why we need to make decisions about our lives if we're to realize the good of autonomy. The second challenge takes this idea on board and then presses two further claims. These are, first, the claim that normative self-creation is only conditionally valuable, and second, that once this fact is appreciated, there's no good autonomy-based objection to coercive governmental measures, paternalistic and moralistic, designed to prevent or dissuade people from pursuing bad options or engaging in worthless activities. Coercive paternalism and moralism, however, don't sit well with the liberal commitment to limited government. In short, if liberal perfectionism appeals to the good of autonomy in order to make good on its commitment to limited government, then it's going to fail to deliver on its promise, or so this second challenge maintains. To gauge the force of the second challenge, we need to consider each of its two claims more carefully. Many writers on autonomy have argued that it remains valuable even when it's exercised in ways that are detrimental to the agent. You have an autonomy-based claim, they think, to make decisions that are degrading or harmful to yourself. However, if we understand autonomy as a perfection, and if we understand it as involving normative self-creation, then this view looks much less plausible. In responding to the first challenge, I've already explained part of the reason why this is so. Efforts to lead an autonomous life should not impede our efforts to live a practically reasonable life. However, in making decisions about the shape of one's life, it would be unreasonable to make decisions that are degrading or harmful to oneself. Much here remains to be explained. Normative self-creation, I've said, is a complex process that involves an interplay between one's decisions about how to lead one's life and the development of an evaluative stance that guides one in making those decisions. Consider now an agent whose normative self-creation has gone wrong in the way we are now entertaining. So the agent is disposed to go for the degrading, the foolish, the pointless, the harmful. He's a lost cause, it looks like. Our question is whether this agent's normative self-creation is valuable in the sense that it gives him reasons to continue going down that bad path. The question's more complicated than it first appears. We need to consider the agent's situation as the agent himself understands it. Now, here are three possibilities to think about. First, the agent may view his situation as we view it. That is, from his point of view, he's disposed to go for the bad, and his evaluative stance endorses or coheres with this disposition. Second possibility, the agent may view his decisions as ones that respond appropriately to the reasons that he has. That is, as he sees matter, he's not going for the foolish or the harmful. He's pursuing the good. It's just that he's mistaken. Third, the agent may view his situation as we view it, but his disposition to go for the bad is at odds with his own evaluative stance. His own stance as a practical reasoner condemns the very decisions that he's disposed to make. Now, this third possibility, the one I just mentioned, raises really interesting issues, but I want to put it aside here. An agent who makes decisions that go against the grain of his evaluative stance is not making autonomous decisions. He fails to lead his life on his own terms, even though the decisions that he makes may still be ones for which he is responsible. The first two possibilities concern me here, so let's take the first one first. The agent pursues something that is bad for him under the description that it's bad for him. Note that this is not a case in which the agent is harming himself because he thinks it's good that he be harmed. Sometimes people have that thought. It's good that I suffer a harm. It'd be good for me. But that's not what this agent is thinking. He seems to acknowledge that there's a conclusive reason for him not to take up this pursuit. The pursuit in question, however, coheres with his evaluative stance. The agent, in effect, is saying, well, it seems like there's conclusive reason for me to not take up this pursuit. There is, in fact, a reason for me to do so. It's a reason provided by the good of autonomy. My normative self-creation grounds the reason in question. Now, while this response is intelligible, it's not one that can withstand scrutiny. It gives agents a power to create reasons that they do not have. True, if autonomy is a perfection, and if autonomy involves normative self-creation, then normative self-creation and the choices and decisions that constitute it is a good, and as such can be the source of reasons. What I'm rejecting here is not the thought that agents have the power to create reasons, nor the thought that the good of autonomy involves the creation of reasons. What I'm rejecting is the thought that an agent's choice to pursue a project or end can turn a worthless pursuit into one that the agent has reason to pursue. If agents had this power, then in a sense they couldn't make mistakes. In going down bad paths, they would transform them into the paths that they have reason to go down. Accordingly, even from the agent's own misguided evaluative stance, he ought to acknowledge that he has no reason to pursue the unworthy pursuits he has adopted. He could insist that he must go down his own path, whether it be good or bad. His autonomy demands it. But if he says this, then he's saying that in order to realize autonomy, he must be practically unreasonable. And as we saw in the discussion of the first challenge, this is not a plausible view, at least if autonomy is understood as a perfection. Now consider the second possibility. This, to recall, is the possibility in which the agent regards his decisions as reasonable when in fact they aren't reasonable. From his own point of view, he's making reasonable decisions. He does not self-consciously reject reason. It's just he's mistaken. He misunderstands what it's reasonable to do. The agent in this case can agree that his normative self-creation is not valuable if it's based on mistaken beliefs about its value. If the agent were to maintain that his normative self-creation remains valuable, even if he were mistaken about its value, then he would adopt a stance like the agent in the first possibility that we've already considered. So these considerations support the claim that normative self-creation, if it's valuable at all, is only conditionally valuable. So the first claim pressed by the second challenge, accordingly, seems to be on firm ground. This opens the door for coercive governmental measures, paternalistic and moralistic, that are designed to prevent or dissuade people from going down bad paths. For if normative self-creation is only conditionally valuable, then it would seem to follow that there's a sound autonomy-based objection to interfering with people's efforts to create valuable lives for themselves, but not lives centered on worthless pursuits. Governmental measures that close off or raise the cost of pursuing disvaluable options, while they may set back the autonomy of those interfered with, do not set back the kind of autonomous agency that adds value or perfection to a human life. This conclusion has been resisted by writers who are sympathetic to liberal perfectionism. Thomas Herka, for example, claims that if autonomy is a perfection, then any restriction on it is prima facie objectionable. And this follows from his argument that our autonomy is augmented not only by the options we choose, but also by the options that we forgo. So, for example, if Jane has 6 options and Sally has 5, and Jane and Sally both autonomously choose the same option, then, or so Herke argues, Jane more fully realizes autonomy, since she forgoes 5 options, whereas Jane only forgoes 4. So on Herke's argument, it would still be the case that even if we imagine both Jane and Sally pursuing the same valuable option, it will still be the case that because one of them had fewer options to turn down, that they'll have realized autonomy to less of a degree. Now, I think we should reject this argument. It's true that people need access to a sufficiently wide, this is one of the things I said, a sufficiently wide range of options to achieve autonomy. But beyond the sufficiency threshold, there's little reason to think that additional options augment autonomy. And there may be even circumstances where the additional options make them less autonomous. People have argued this. So a state that promotes autonomy needs to ensure that citizens have a wide range of options. The paternalistic and moralistic measures that the state might consider adopting need not reduce the option set below this sufficiency level. Further, notice that if Herke's argument were correct, then governments would have a prima facie reason to bring into existence additional options, including worthless options, for its members, because doing so would augment their autonomy by increasing the number of options that they could forgo. So the state might support, like, subsidize heroin use, because then all of us could forego that option, thereby increasing our valuable autonomous agency. But this seems implausible, to put it mildly. There's no standing reason to create worthless options. A better line of resistance is available, however, and it starts by reminding us that to be autonomous, people need to be independent, and that coercion and manipulation threaten or compromise this independence. Furthermore, and importantly, coercion and manipulation have an expressive significance that explains why they're especially inimical to autonomy. It's not just that coercion closes off options, it expresses disrespect for the will of the coerced agent. Thus, by highlighting the evils of coercion and manipulation, we may be able to turn back the second challenge while conceding its first claim. That is, we may be able to grant that normative self-creation is only conditionally valuable, while still insisting that coercive and manipulative measures are ruled out by a due regard for autonomy, even when the coercive and manipulative measures in question accurately target options that no one has any reason to engage in. This is the line that Joseph Raz takes. So in my terms, when he confronts the second challenge, he accepts the idea that autonomy and normative self-creation is only conditionally valuable, but then he tries to say there's still good reasons to resist government efforts to coercively close off options. And he, in particular, Raz appeals to the expressive dimension of coercion that I've been alluding to. So I want to look at this a little more closely. I think there's something this line of thought gets right. I just think that it's exaggerated. So coercion and manipulation close off options or make it harder to engage with them. But the same is true of many other factors that impede autonomous agency, such as changes in one's natural environment or the unintended consequences of countless other people. So we might say, let's call any impediment, let's call any factor, irrespective of source, that diminishes an agent's access to options or his ability to engage with them, let's call that factor an impediment. It seems clear that not every impediment compromises autonomy. Physical laws, such as the law of gravity, affect one's access to options. But this factor is a background determinant of the context from which we confront different options. It's a parameter, not a real limitation on our option set. Other impediments may compromise the autonomy of some people, but not others. The option to work on a family farm can be vital to someone's autonomy, given his evaluative stance and his past commitment in this option. But if market dynamics eliminate this option, as farming is taken over by large agricultural companies, then this agent will suffer a setback to his autonomy. Here it comes about not through coercion, just kind of what the market has done. But the elimination of this option may have no effect at all on the autonomy of many others who have no interest or past investment in family farming. Now, autonomy, I've said, doesn't require access to a maximal set of options. One needs access to a sufficiently wide range of options only. Of course, there are difficult issues here about how to specify what qualifies as a sufficiently wide range. I just allowed that an agent's past investment in an option can make it vital to his autonomy in a way that it's not vital to the autonomy of others. But however these issues get sorted out, it would be true of any agent that there are options, the presence or absence of which do not affect his autonomous agency. So we can just call these dispensable options. Coercion and manipulation, it's often claimed, always invade autonomy. If this claim were correct, then whether or not an option was properly classified as dispensable could turn on how it was impeded. Thus, to take the earlier example, if I, who have no interest at all in farming, if I'm prevented from being a family farmer because of market dynamics, then this impediment would not set back my autonomy at all. But if I'm prevented from doing so because my government has banned family farming, for whatever reason, then the foreclosure of this option would compromise my autonomy. Or so many people seem to think. It's not immediately apparent, however, exactly what considerations support this judgment. This is getting back to why should the source of the obstacle matter? Now, the government's action in my example is coercive, while the impediment that results from market dynamics is not. And a key feature of being subject to coercion is that there's another agent or group of agents who seek to control you. They aim to subject your will to their control. Their efforts to impede your access to the option in question is deliberate. And there's no question that this fact affects the social meaning of the impediment. People can and do resent coercive interference. They cannot fittingly resent impediments that arise in ways that do not implicate the interfering agency of others. But while all of this is correct, and while it explains why coercion has a normative significance that these other impediments lack, it doesn't yet explain why coercion compromises autonomy to a greater degree than these other impediments. Maybe this is the thought behind the worry about coercion. Coercive impediments tend to have this tracking feature that other kind of impediments lack. The coercer targets the will of his victim, adjusting his own actions to the actions of the victim in order to get her to do or forbear from doing what he wants her to do. Impersonal impediments that arise from nature, from the uncoordinated activities of countless other people, impede, but they do not track or target the will of the impeded agent in this way. So this would help to explain why coercion often presents a greater threat to autonomy than other kinds of impediment. Nevertheless, the threat that coercion poses to autonomy is still understood here to be a function of its impact on the option set of the coerced party. And we are presently trying to understand why it has a significance for autonomy that goes beyond its impact on access to options. Might this further significance be found in the social meaning of coercion and manipulation itself? Joseph Raz suggests as much. He writes, and I'm quoting him here, "The natural fact that coercion and manipulation reduce options or distort normal processes of decision and the formation of preferences has become the basis of a social convention, loading them with meaning regardless of their actual consequences. They've acquired a symbolic meaning expressing disregard or even contempt for the coerced or manipulated people." Suppose this is right. It still doesn't explain why being the victim of express disregard or contempt must set back one's autonomy. Granted, it's bad for people to be subject to disregard and contempt, but why must the badness of this be explained in terms of its impact on one's autonomy? I said autonomous agency requires one to have certain mental capacities and character traits. One must have the self-awareness and vigor necessary to take control of one's affairs, as well as the steadiness needed to sustain commitments to the plans and goals that one adopts. And so maybe being the victim of expressed disregard and contempt, especially if one's government is the source of the message, maybe that could impair the mental capacities and sense of self that are necessary to be an effective agent in leading one's life on one's own terms. But this would be an extreme reaction, perhaps one that could be appropriate, but only when the coercion and manipulation in question were extreme. The question I'm here pressing can look trivial. Is it not just a matter of bookkeeping how we characterize the badness of the disregard and contempt that coercion and manipulation allegedly express? If they're bad, then they're bad, and as such they can be part of the explanation for why the state should not employ coercion and manipulation in its efforts to promote good lives. In a sense, I agree, but part of my argument in this talk is that appeals to autonomy do less work than many think in justifying limits to government power. Accordingly, to ground a commitment to limited government, one may need to appeal to a whole host of disparate considerations, including considerations related to expressive values, over and above any appeal to autonomy. So the bookkeeping issue is not pointless. Still, in an effort to turn back the second challenge, we might consider helping ourselves both to the value of autonomy and to the expressive concerns in question. We need then to ask how powerful these expressive concerns really are. The first point to make, this will be true of any kind of expressive argument, the first point to make is that expressive harms are belief dependent. One experiences the harm in virtue of the beliefs that one holds, and perhaps the beliefs that others around one hold, that confer meaning on the action. These beliefs, in turn, can be subjected to rational analysis. We can ask whether the beliefs in question are reasonable or appropriate. Once the issue is framed in these terms, we can see immediately that not every expressive harm generated by the coercive actions of others should concern us. Someone who quite unreasonably rejects coercive governmental action and then sincerely reports that he experiences the government's action as expressing disregard or contempt for him as an autonomous agent should be told, in effect, that the problem lies with himself. Since the government's coercion is reasonable, he and others have reason to support it, and he and others should not be insulted by it. This is what we should say, I think, to a pedophile who objects to government coercion that's employed to protect children from abuse. Now, Raz seems to accept this point after claiming in The Morality of Freedom that all coercive interventions invade autonomy. He acknowledges that a liberal state would need to employ coercion in its efforts to secure the conditions of autonomy for all its members. But these coercive measures, he claims, need not express any contempt or disregard to those who are coerced. Consider, for example, state-run public education. This will require government coercion, both to fund the schools and to require parents to send their children to the schools. But if some parents object to this coercion and claim that it expresses disregard for them as autonomous agents, then the reply should be that they misrepresent the meaning of the government action in question. Properly interpreted, it expresses no contempt or disregard. Raz insists, however, that governmental coercion that goes beyond what is necessary to secure the conditions for autonomous agency for everyone is different. Commenting on his argument in The Morality of Freedom, he writes, "The measures I supported avoid direct coercion for perfectionist causes, i.e. coercion to close off worthless options." It's that kind of coercive governmental paternalism and moralism that we're talking about. The Razian position accordingly can grant the general point that not all state coercion expresses disregard or contempt to the coerced, while holding the line against paternalistic and moralistic measures that aim to dissuade people from engaging in worthless pursuits. It can hold that these latter measures do indeed express disregard and contempt to the coerced. In this way, the Razian position can rebut the second claim pressed by the second challenge. However, on inspection, the Razian position looks unstable. Once it's granted that our fundamental interest is to live a valuable autonomous life, not an autonomous life as such, then state coercion that furthers this fundamental interest should be on all fours with state coercion that furthers autonomous agency only. After all, in the perfectionist view of politics that we're considering, autonomy is of value because and to the extent that it contributes to a good human life. But autonomy understood as a perfection is only conditionally valuable. Its presence in a life does not necessarily improve it. Autonomy contributes to the goodness of a human life only when it's realized through engagement with worthwhile endeavors. Now imagine a well-crafted, coercive, paternalistic restriction that effectively raises the cost of pursuing a targeted, disvaluable option. If some were to object to this restriction on the grounds that it expresses disregard or contempt to them, then a possible reply is that they misrepresent the meaning of the government action in question. Properly understood, it expresses no contempt. What it signals is that the government takes seriously its duty to help establish conditions that enable its members to lead valuable autonomous lives. Now, is this reply cogent? I think the question can't be answered in the abstract, because the meaning of government action is a social fact, one that's dependent in all sorts of complex ways on the beliefs of the people who are subject to it. We can distinguish, however, two situations. In the first situation, government action is objectionable for reasons that have nothing to do with expressive harm. Here, the expressive harm, the perceived sense of insult, augments the prior wrongness of the government action. In the second situation, government action is justified, absent consideration of expressive harm. So here the expressive harm would stand on its own, as it were. And it's that second situation that's the interesting one, for it shows how the prospect of expressive harm could transform otherwise justified government action into unjustified government action. Notice, however, that in this second situation, the victims of expressive harm must think that the government action is unjustified, and unjustified for reasons that do not advert to the expressive harm. If they thought the government action were justified, then they would not interpret it as expressing disregard or contempt to those subject to it. Thus, the expressive harm in this situation rests on mistaken beliefs about the justifiability of the government action in question. And the fact that this expressive harm rests on these mistaken beliefs, in turn, should condition our own assessment of its moral significance. We should downgrade its moral import, since we should not hold otherwise justified governmental action hostage to the mistaken beliefs of those who oppose it. If this is right, then it does not look like the expressive considerations can be successfully invoked to rule out the permissibility of well-crafted coercive government measures designed to help people lead good lives. So recall the dialectic. We've been considering what I've been calling the second challenge. The challenge consists of two claims. These are first the claims that normative self-creation is conditionally valuable. And second, that once you grant that, once you acknowledge that normative self-creation and autonomy are only conditionally valuable, then there's no good autonomy-based objection to coercive governmental measures designed to prevent or dissuade people from pursuing bad options or engaging in worthless activities. The first claim I argued is sound. I then considered attempts to rebut the second claim, given the truth of the first claim. The most promising effort we saw appeals to the symbolic or expressive dimension of coercion and manipulation. But on close inspection, I've argued that this effort can't make good on its promise. Absent some other as yet unidentified cogent line of response, I conclude we should accept the second claim. Accordingly, since I've already accepted the first claim, the second challenge, as far as I can see, is successful. You might be tempted to conclude that if I'm right, then liberal perfectionism is a failed project. The liberal commitment to limited government just can't be sustained in light of the perfectionist commitment to use state power to promote good lives. But this is not, in fact, the conclusion I think we should draw. In the 1970s and 1980s, political philosophers who considered themselves to be liberals invested much energy in an effort to identify the key principle or the key value that defined liberalism as a political theory. This was all when I was a graduate student in the early 1990s. This is what it seemed like. There was all this kind of liberal self-interpretation. It's a lot of what political philosophy seemed to be involved in. So everybody was trying to identify, like, here's the fundamental value. Some people appealed to neutrality. Some people appealed to some principle of equality. Some people appealed to the harm principle. But the idea was to try to identify the essence or the core, the foundation of liberalism. And in this kind of environment, it was natural for perfectionists, who were also considered themselves liberals, to propose their own master value, and autonomy seemed to fit the bill. Autonomy looks like it's both a perfectionist good and looks like it's a plausible foundational value of liberalism. So what happened is liberal perfectionists, on my reading, elevated its status in an account of political morality. But in hindsight, this all looks like a mistake. For one thing, efforts to identify liberalism with a specific foundational principle always end up construing liberalism in overly narrow terms. Liberalism as a tradition of political thought is just too diverse to be brought under a single umbrella. For another thing, it ignores the possibility that the liberal commitment to limited government is supported by a host of different considerations, with some of these considerations being more salient in some contexts than in others. Much support for limited government in reality comes not from high-minded principles and ideals, but from more mundane worries about the competence of governments to discharge certain tasks. We often support limits to government action because we do not trust our government to do the job well. We fear it will misuse the power given to it. Paternalistic measures may be justified in the abstract, but in this or that circumstance, they're likely to do more harm than good, or so we fear. In addition, even when the government is fully up to the task at hand, it must deal with the evident fact that many of those subject to its authority have mistaken views about their rights and entitlements. A moment ago, I said that we should not hold otherwise justified government action hostage to the mistaken beliefs of those who oppose it. While correct, this was an overstatement. Government action that would be justified if people had sound views can become unjustified when many have mistaken views. It may just provoke too much resistance, for example, or it may do more harm than good in its impact on people's lives. These are the well-known realities of politics under non-ideal conditions, which are, of course, the conditions of politics as we know it. The liberal case for limited government on the perfectionist view of politics, I will conclude, likely has more to do with the imperfections of governments and the imperfections of those over whom they rule than it does with perfectionist ideals like autonomy. Recognizing this point should lead us to reject neither perfectionist political morality nor to abandon the liberal commitment to limited government.